I'm Christopher, and we are going to continue with the final 2 episodes of this video. Grant just won the election, and it just said the popular vote was in his favor. The electoral vote was much closer. I just went back and rewatched the last 10 seconds just to make sure I got that correct. So, video.
Grant securing 214 votes compared to just 80 for Seymour. As a result, on the 4th of March 1869, Ulysses S. Grant was sworn into office as the 18th President of the United States. He would serve for 8 years, winning a second term in 1872, with a much more comprehensive victory over a divided opposition. During the
Already?
The price of wireless Bluetooth headphones down to $259. Why is no one jumping on such a low?
During the 8 years in which he served as President of the United States, Grant would have to grapple with a large number of very grave challenges. None was more pressing than the issue of Reconstruction and the reunifying of the country after the trauma of a 4-year civil war. 2 weeks after entering office, he signed laws guaranteeing African Americans equal rights. Then, in the months that followed, his administration pressured those former Confederate states which had not ratified the 15th Amendment into doing so. This would guarantee Black Americans the right to vote in elections. The trade-off for the southern states in accepting this...
It's pretty sad that you have to force them to do something after they lost. Like that, it really shouldn't be acceptable to have postponed it. You know, I understand they didn't do it under Johnson because Johnson really didn't push it. But when Grant comes into office, it would have been 68, I think they said, which would have been 3 years after Lincoln died. So we can say 3 years after the war ended. And it still had not been signed. So that's... But then again, I don't know what was everything that was happening at the time. So, we just got done with the war. Let's settle everything before... Let's breathe. So, yeah, maybe I'm an idiot.
Would be readmittance to the Union once it had been ratified by each state legislature. As a result of this carrot-and-stick approach, by 1871, the recalcitrant states, including Georgia, Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas, had complied and were readmitted to the Union. But in other respects, Reconstruction under Grant proved more difficult.
I think that after the war... I don't know if this is true, but after the war, the Union should have moved in and took control of the rebel states. And I mean politically. The politicians should have done this. And after things were ratified, I think then that you hold elections and you allow people, because those northern people who come down, they're not going to stay there. They're just there kind of like as a getting things reestablished. But so long as that state is going to hold out and do things, then you're having northern beliefs pushed upon you. But as soon as things are allowed to happen, you get people to vote and you get new politicians in and stuff like that. I think then it should have slowly been taken out. I'm not exactly sure if that happened, but it seems like something that would have maybe helped reestablish the South and then maybe not made them feel forced to do things, because you're kind of taking control immediately and then you're relinquishing that control back to them. Maybe that happened. I don't know.
Armed bands of traditional Southern conservatives sprung up across the former Confederate states in the late 1860s and early 1870s. The Ku Klux Klan was just the most prominent of these, and others, such as the Red Shirts and White League, collectively termed Redeemers, strove to use violence and intimidation to reclaim control of the southern states of the Democratic Party and force through a white supremacist agenda. In response, Grant's administration created the U.S. Justice Department and charged it with cracking down on white Redeemer movements in the South. In tandem, the Federal Army was dispatched to key sites in order to maintain law and order and defend Reconstruction. The result, it is generally acknowledged, is that Grant's administration crushed the power of the Ku Klux Klan for a generation in the South by arresting hundreds of senior members and prosecuting many of its most powerful benefactors who financed the Klan. Nevertheless, despite these efforts, it was clear by the mid-1870s that Reconstruction was largely failing.
That was when the Klan would have rallies. They made it mandatory that you showed up with your mask on, because they did not. So one of the things that the Department of Justice and Grant had done is they started linking people, because some people would just show up, see their face. And they started, you'd arrest one guy. And what do? You go up. Give me someone above you. And then you get that person. Give me someone above you. You get that person. And this person's going to get a lighter sentence than this person, then this person, then this person, then this person. And so that was how they ended up all snitching on each other, which is something that happens. Gangs do it. It's just no one wants to go to jail. You can talk tough. The mob does it. Everyone talks tough until a massive jail sentence is in your face. There are a few that will do it, but a lot of other people, man, they enjoy that freedom. So they'll what do you need to know? Whatever it takes to get me a smaller jail sentence and maybe get me the hell out of here. Well, that's what they did. And so the Klan would have these rallies and everyone had to show up, and they started keeping people at distance like they had COVID or something, because you didn't want anyone near you who might pick up a dialect or something like that and know, oh my gosh, that's Frank. No, well, if shit goes down, I'm going after Frank. Oh my gosh, I hope Frank doesn't know that was me. And before you know it, people were turning on each other before the heat even got to them, and they just disintegrated. I read that in Grant, Ron Chernow, by Ron Chernow. It was a fantastic book, by the way. But yeah, he had them so worried they started turning on themselves. It's fascinating. It's a great book, but it's fascinating about that aspect.
And Redeemer Democrats were seeking to create a society in the South, which, in the absence of slavery, would still disenfranchise and savagely oppress the large African American population across the former Confederate states. Reconstruction was intimately tied to the finances of the country. During the war, the Union government had resorted to issuing banknotes that were not backed up by the gold or silver standard. In the 19th century, all Western governments only issued money that was backed by a certain amount of gold and silver bullion reserves. The emergency caused by the Civil War had seen Lincoln's administration resorting to simply printing banknotes, resulting in considerable inflation. To correct the situation, Grant passed the Public Credit Act within 3 weeks of entering office. This essentially promised those who held banknotes issued during the Civil War that they would be repaid in coin backed by the gold and silver standard. The idea here was to curb inflation and also introduce much greater confidence into the financial system that the Civil War banknotes, termed greenback notes, were as good as real money and would not become worthless now that the war was receding in the collective memory. The overall effect of this was a continuation of the economic recovery, which had already started under Johnson's administration between 1865 and 1869. Yet it was not all smooth sailing on the financial front across the 8 years of Grant's administration. In 1873, an economic crisis developed following the collapse of the New York brokerage firm J. Cook & Company, which was heavily involved in the railway building boom of the time. As the west and east coasts were connected via extensive train lines, This was compounded by frailties in the global economic system, with Germany having demonetized silver in the aftermath of the unification of the country in 1871, triggering a series of financial failures in European capitals such as Vienna. The resulting downturn led to an economic depression which would linger for the remainder of Grant's second term, creating financial hardship for many American citizens. The economic crisis was known at the time as the Great Depression, but this term was abandoned 70 years later when a much deeper economic crisis led to the period after the Wall Street crash of 1929 becoming known as the Great Depression. Accordingly, the economic crash and depression of 1873 to 1877 is today termed the Panic of 1873. On the foreign stage, Grant's policies were calm.
What, we can't have two Great Depressions? Got to change the wording of one because it... Okay. All right.
And pacifist. Despite his military background, he was no warmonger and deliberately tried to avoid conflict. However, he was also thoroughly inexperienced as a diplomat and left his foreign policy largely in the hands of the Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish. A number of issues confronted the US in the late 1860s. Firstly, the matter of reparations, and an apology from the British government for its supplying of naval support to the Confederacy during the Civil War remained unresolved. Several years of negotiation
I didn't realize they apologized. Huh.
Eventually resulted in the Treaty of Washington in 1871, whereby Britain acknowledged its role in building ships for the Confederacy and agreed to pay over $15 million in reparations. Thereafter,
Wow, I didn't know that.
US-British relations improved steadily,
Or I didn't remember it.
and the two countries have been allies ever since. Just as pressing was the US's policy in the Caribbean, where a war, the 10 Years' War,
beautiful.
had broken out between Cuban rebels and Spain in 1868. Despite occurring on its front door, the US maintained a policy of fairly strict neutrality in this, the first of 3 independence wars waged on the island of Cuba in the second half of the 19th century. More interventionist was the approach of the Grant administration to the island of Hispaniola. Then, as now, this was divided into 2 countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, or Santo Domingo. Grant was of the view that by acquiring control over Santo Domingo, the US could gain a strategic interest in the Caribbean, and also in the lucrative sugar trade of the region. In 1869, negotiations were opened with the government there to purchase the country, with US business interests acting as intermediaries. But after 18 months of wrangling over this, the scheme came to nothing, largely owing to the opposition from within Congress. The affair tarnished Grant's reputation to some extent, and is an indication of the creeping imperialist aspirations of the US in advance of the most aggressive period of American empire in the 1890s. Grant's approach towards the Native American people was enlightened by 19th century standards. He was a relatively benign assimilationist, believing that the Native American people should be treated fairly and enjoined to embrace the benefits of a Western education, economy, culture, and government. This might seem like a heavy-handed form of cultural intolerance by today's standards, but for a country which counted several presidencies in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, whose policies towards the Native American people had bordered on genocidal, Grant's approach was comparatively progressive. As a result, several peace treaties were negotiated with the Apache and Sioux ends of the Plains and Midwest during his first term in office, and conflict between the Native American people and the federal government was at an historic low. However, Grant's Native American policy could ultimately not escape the historical circumstances in which it was conceived. Try
nice.
as he might to forge a new pathway, decades of conflict, oppression, and broken promises had created a thick air of animosity towards the US government amongst the Plains Indians. This was compounded in 1874 when gold was discovered in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory. As prospectors streamed into the region, the Sioux Indians there, led by Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull, prepared for conflict. The Great Sioux War of 1876 and 1877 was a bitter end to Grant's presidency. Though famed for the victory, Sitting Bull's Lakota Sioux Indians won over General George A. Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn in late June 1876. The war ultimately ended in victory for the federal government. The administration of Rutherford B. Hayes, who had succeeded Grant by the time the war ended, imposed a harsh peace settlement whereby the lands of the Sioux were annexed and the Plains Indians of the region were forced into Indian reservations, a depressing end to Grant's enlightened Indian policy. In many other ways, Grant was ahead of his time. For instance, in 1875, he proposed a constitutional amendment to fundamentally weaken the ability of religious groups and churches to dominate the educational curriculum in a given state or region. Essentially, here he was calling for greater separation of church and state in a manner which was only beginning to be countenanced in the more liberal European countries. Equally, he was progressive in his advocacy for America's Jews, appointing dozens of Jewish Americans to federal office.
I wonder if he felt guilty because of the order he gave during the Civil War about banishing all the Jewish people because he said they were profiting and stuff like that. But his father was doing the same thing. I know he apologized for it. It is a blight on his record. But I wonder if this was his attempt to kind of make up for it.
Perhaps most unusual was his appointment of Eli S. Parker, a Seneca Indian, as his commissioner for Indian affairs. Yet Grant's presidency was not without scandal.
I think Parker was the one at Appomattox, I believe, for the surrender of, I could be wrong, but I want to say it was Parker that was there, and that was when Robert E. Lee saw him and said, "It's nice that there's a true American here." And he said, "We're all Americans now, sir," or "We're all Americans," or something like that. It was a very I can't even talk. It was like spontaneous, but very just a nice thing to say. Like, no, we're all Americans. It's very nice.
Either. During the 1872 election campaign, the press revealed that a number of prominent members of the Republican Party had been involved in siphoning profits from the Union Pacific Railroad Company through a shady corporate entity called Crédit Mobilier. Grant, who it must be said was scrupulously honest throughout his military and political career, was not implicated directly, but the fallout, nevertheless, damaged the Republicans, and by implication, his presidency. Worse followed in 1875 with the so-called Whiskey Ring Scandal. This had involved prominent federal officials and whiskey distillers defrauding the government out of tax revenues, facilitated by a widespread system of bribery. Again, Grant was not involved, but his private secretary, Orville E. Babcock, was.
I don't blame Grant for these things in terms of him breaking the law, being involved in them. What I do fault is him having these people in office who did it. You may be innocent of it, but you hired those people, so you are guilty by association. Now you got to throw him some credit and say, okay, well, he didn't do anything. Yes, but he was a very loyal person, and sometimes you have to put the country over loyalty, country over party. You know, this has to come first. All of us have to come before your group.
As was the Secretary of War, William Belknap. Resignations followed, but Grant again was damaged in the final 2 years of his presidency by the actions of others. The final act of Grant's presidency became one of the most controversial moments in the constitutional and electoral history of the United States, though Grant acquitted himself well throughout the course of it. With Grant having served 2 terms, the Republican Party had selected Rutherford B. Hayes to contest the 1876 presidential election against the Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden. The election was held on the 7th of November, 1876. The result, when it came, was highly contentious. In the mid-1870s, there were 369 electoral college votes. When the votes were counted, it was clear that Tilden had won 184 votes, one short of the 185 needed to be elected president. Hayes had certainly won 165 votes, but 20 votes were the subject of considerable dispute. These were the electoral college votes for the states of Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon. In the case of Oregon, the vote was contested as one of the electors for the state was found to be illegitimate, as he was an appointed official there, while in the other 3 states the vote was close enough that both parties claimed victory. The dispute dragged on into 1877. As it did, Grant, as the sitting president, came center stage. He instructed Congress to resolve the matter through legislative action and according to the electoral rules. He also refrained from mobilizing the army in the event of continuing disagreement, and on the 29th of January 1877, he formed an electoral commission to decide on the matter. This eventually...
We're going to stop it there. What's he going to do? He's forming a commission. Reconstruction. And next, have we had enough? Okay. So we're going to end it here. And if you don't come back, you don't like or subscribe, you're never going to know the ending. You're never going to know what happens next. Alley-oop.